Welcome back to Women's Strength and Bodybuilding, where we highlight beautiful and talented women who compete. My name is Mark, and in today's video, we'll cover the history of women's bodybuilding up until the late 1970s. Before we jump in, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss a beat. We've got a lot to cover here. The point of delving into the history of women's bodybuilding is to paint a picture how we went from this to what we see on stage and on social media today. Since there's quite a bit to unpack on this subject, I'll be splitting it up into a couple parts. Today we'll look at the origins of women's bodybuilding, so from the late 1800s through the 1970s. Keep an eye out for the next part in the series, which will cover from the 1980s to present day. I'm currently working on it, and we'll link it here once it's available. The crazy thing about women's bodybuilding is that in comparison to this span of time, it's almost entirely brand new. And by brand new, I mean since the late 19th century. If humans date back 300,000 years ago, then strong, muscular, and aesthetic women have existed for about 0.04% of that time. Throughout the course of history, there are pretty much no notable muscular or strong women that come up before the late 1800s and early 1900s. I don't doubt that there were in some instances, but it was most likely few and far between, and the ones who were probably got treated as social outcasts. And in the 1800s, women who were able to perform impressive feats of strength worked in the circus as part of an act. This was probably due to accepted societal gender norms. And I'm not even making this up. Doctors and medical professionals used to categorize women as having very little strength and stamina, whose remaining energy after childbirth was best put towards raising children and homemaking. They used to say that the only exercise women needed could be found in the home. Like, bro, what the fuck? Many women shied away from physical fitness because health educators of the era stated it caused the female body to be more like that of a man. This old stereotype still scares a lot of women away from lifting weights to this day. I meet so many women that want to lift, but are afraid of getting big and muscular like a female bodybuilder. To which I reply that might not be a bad thing, because these ladies are some of the most beautiful on the planet. Moving on. The purpose of these videos is to give you a better understanding of how we went from this in the 1800s to this not even 150 years later. Like I mentioned earlier, well-documented strong women are tough to come by throughout history, just as a general rule, because again, the acceptable gender norms that existed during those times. I have lots of conversations with people today about female bodybuilders, and unfortunately, there are still a few mixed opinions about it. But for those of us who love it like I do, let's continue on. Now let's go way back for a second. It's been said that the Spartan women in ancient Greece were encouraged to be strong and physically fit like their male counterparts. But that's just one civilization, of very few alike. The majority of other civilizations, like the Romans for example, painted women as soft and curvy with almost no upper body strength. Even in mythology, we find that goddesses and Amazon women were portrayed more as superhuman, rather than physically strong and muscular like their male counterparts. I'm sure there's been exceptions to this generalization over time. However, things begin to heat up, and we start to see more strong women around 1890. During this time, 3 women, Sandwina, Vulcana, and Minerva, dominated the strong woman scene. Sandwina was from Germany, and was able to perform feats of strength, like lifting her husband overhead with one arm, and pressing 200 pounds overhead. Vulcana was another name of that era, who was from Great Britain and able to bent arm press 140 pounds. Funny story, Vulcana sometimes ran into trouble when her co-workers had overhyped both of their strength and capabilities just a little too much, and at times they were outlifted by members of the audience in a challenge. But still, we're talking about grassroots beginnings here. But out of all 3 of these notable women, Minerva was definitely the strongest. She was able to lift 300-pound barrels to her shoulders and challenged other women to outlift her in an article that was published in the newspaper. After no other women stepped forward to accept the challenge, she was declared the world's strongest woman. In 1901, old-school muscle man Eugen Sandow put together what could be considered the first unofficial bodybuilding, or physical culture as they called it in those times, contest for men and women. But sadly, he ended up canceling the women's show from lack of people signing up. Remind you of anyone? In 1903, Bernard McFadden held another physical culture show in which he offered $500 in prize money to the men's and women's winners. Can you believe that? They paid both the men's and the women's divisions equally. Emma Newkirk ended up winning the show, and McFadden, the organizer, was so delighted with the outcomes of the shows that he ended up hosting several events from then on. You might have noticed that for the most part, these women are a far cry from what we see on stages today. The women still look soft to a degree, and were definitely not as muscular, ripped, and vascular as they are today. But in time, all that was about to change. The 1930s saw the rise of what could be considered the first true women's bodybuilding stars. During the 1930s, Ivy Russell toured around Great Britain and Ireland and helped popularize women's weightlifting in Britain just before World War II. Ivy had some impressive pulls for that time and focused mainly on standardized lifts like the clean and jerk. At her peak, she was able to deadlift 400 pounds. She successfully petitioned the British Amateur Weightlifting Association to host an official weightlifting competition in 1930, which she ended up winning. Ivy was what some consider the first major champion, an early stride for women's weightlifting and bodybuilding. But for better or worse, Ivy's contributions have become overshadowed by a different contender of the time, Pudgy Stockton. Chances are, if you've ever Googled vintage female bodybuilder, photos of Pudgy would come up, looking like a muscular pinup girl. So yeah, Pudgy Stockton, who really wasn't pudgy at all. It just so happens that was given to her as a childhood nickname, was what some consider the main predecessor of modern-day female bodybuilders. She would hang out at Muscle Beach and perform feats of strength with her husband Les, and claimed to be featured on over 40 magazine covers. She also wrote a monthly column about women in weightlifting called Barbells, which was featured on Strength and Health magazine, which would be equivalent to something like Flex or Muscle and Fitness today. Much like Ivy, Pudgy was able to help orchestrate a sanctioned weightlifting competition for women in 1947. Still, at this point, women's bodybuilding shows were practically unheard of outside the physical culture shows we went over earlier. But Pudgy did win one title, Miss Physical Culture Venus. It's crazy to see how much attention Pudgy got during her time, because this was all still brand new. I can't tell you how many shredded women with great physiques I see on social media every day, whose careers never really end up going anywhere. And they're much bigger and more ripped than Pudgy was. I mean, just imagine if a woman like this was first to the movement back in the 1930s. It makes you wonder what the reaction would have been. But still, it's hard to argue with a classic like Pudgy. She was in great shape, and at 5'2" and 115 pounds, it begs the question, how did we go from this to the much larger women of the golden era? Well, men's bodybuilding was really picking up steam in the 1950s into the mid-70s, and to supplement the men's shows, the women would participate in bikini shows or beauty competitions that were much more reminiscent to a pageant. These types of shows could rarely be classified as bodybuilding competitions, but they did serve as a conduit to what things would transition into. It's considered that in the 1960s was when the first female physique-oriented shows like Miss Body Beautiful, Miss Americana, and Miss Physique emerged. These shows just happened to correspond with second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s that caused many women to question and push back against more traditional and antiquated societal norms about their gender roles, working out, and their bodies. The late 1970s is where the first true-to-form female physique shows emerged, and specifically 1977 to 1979 are considered by many as some of the formative years that officially started women's bodybuilding and produced shows that gave women the opportunity to display their physiques, hard-earned through weight training in the same way that men were doing. A fellow by the name of Henry McGee was one of the first people to take his belief in these women to the next level by organizing the first official female bodybuilding competition in Canton, Ohio in November 1977, dubbed the Ohio Regional Women's Physique Championship. Gina Laspina won the first show, and she's regarded as the first ever winner of an official women's bodybuilding contest. In 1978, Doris Hamilton founded Superior Physique Association, or SPA, which was exclusive to female bodybuilding, and wrote about contests, proper training, and diet in a newsletter. 1979 was particularly an important year and produced a lot of monumental female bodybuilding shows. In addition to the newsletter they started issuing in 1978, SPA organized the first ever women's bodybuilding contest in Florida on April 29, 1979, where Laura Combs took first place out of 13 competitors. On August 18, 1979, a promoter named George Snyder put together another female bodybuilding show named the Best in the World contest, and was the first IFBB sanctioned show for women with prize money. One of the main differences between the IFBB and the SPA was, at that time, that the IFBB was ran by men, and the SPA was run entirely by women. Other notable shows that happened in 1979 include the second U.S. Women's National Physique Championship, which Kay Baxter won. Talk about a throwback. The first Women's World Bodybuilding Championship on June 16, 1979, which Lisa Lyon won, and the Robbie Robinson Classic on August 25, 1979. Stacey Bentley won Best Legs, Best Posing, and Best Overall at that show. Side note, for the most part, women at these shows were required to wear high heels and weren't allowed to hit what could be considered the 3 men's poses. Bro, front double bicep pose, the crab or most muscular pose, and the lat spread, which is dumb. What's the point of women training to look big and strong if they can't even show off their development in these poses? So yeah, the women had to wear heels, couldn't do the men's poses, and for the most part looked pretty thin and twig-like for fear of putting on too much muscle mass. But all that was about to change. The 1980s is really the era that springboarded women's bodybuilding into what it is today, and I can't wait to tell you all about it. So be sure to keep an eye out for the next part in the series, the 1980s to the present. I hope you enjoyed learning a bit more about women's bodybuilding as much as I did while making this video. If you did, please like the video and leave a comment about who your favorite vintage female bodybuilder is. And don't forget to subscribe for more great women's strength and bodybuilding content.